The air conditioner hummed quietly in the Manhattan apartment, but it couldn't relieve the tension that hung in the living room. Jonathan Miller held the envelope that had arrived in the mail that morning with trembling hands. The results from GeneTech Laboratory confirmed his worst suspicions. Sarah sat on the beige sofa, her hands protectively over her 6-month belly. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and she avoided her husband's penetrating gaze. "Sarah," Jonathan began, his voice hoarse with contained emotion, "we need to talk." "About what?" she asked, but there was something in her voice that betrayed nervousness. Jonathan approached slowly, the envelope still sealed in his hands. Outside, New York traffic created its usual urban symphony, but inside that apartment, the silence was deafening. "About the baby," he said finally. "About who the real father is." Sarah stood up abruptly, her hands trembling. "Jonathan, what are you talking about? You're scaring me." "I had a DNA test done," he said, tearing open the envelope. "I used samples from your last prenatal exam. I had to know the truth." Sarah's eyes widened. "You did what? How could you do that without telling me?" Jonathan unfolded the paper, his eyes quickly scanning the numbers and percentages. Probability of paternity, 0.04%. Excluded as biological father. The words echoed in the apartment like a gunshot. Sarah sank back onto the sofa, her hands covering her face. "Sarah," Jonathan approached, the paper still in his hands. "It's his, isn't it? Marcus's." She looked up, tears beginning to stream down her cheeks. "It's his, not yours," she whispered, her hand instinctively going to her belly. Jonathan felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. Marcus Thompson, his best friend since college, the best man at their wedding, the man who had been like a brother to him. "How long?" Jonathan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah remained silent, her sobs filling the space between them. Outside, the city's sirens seemed distant, as if they belonged to another world. "How long, Sarah?" he repeated, louder this time. 3 months, she finally admitted. "It started 3 months ago." Jonathan walked to the window, looking at the city's hustle and bustle below. People walked hurriedly along the sidewalks, each with their own dramas and secrets. He wondered how many of them were living lies like the one he had just discovered. "Were you going to tell me?" he asked without turning around. I didn't know how." "So you were going to let me raise a child thinking he was my son?" Sarah's silence was answer enough. The next morning, Jonathan woke up on the couch in his home office, his body aching and his mind still processing the previous night's revelation. Sarah had left early, leaving only a note saying she was going to her sister Rebecca's house in Brooklyn. He looked at the photos on his desk, happy moments that now seemed contaminated by lies. Their wedding photo, where Marcus stood beside him as best man, smiling broadly. Family vacation photos, backyard barbecues, birthdays. How many of them hid the truth? The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was David Chen, his partner at the law firm where they worked together. "John, are you okay? Sarah called me worried, said you two had a terrible fight last night." Jonathan hesitated. David was a good friend, but how could he explain that his life had crumbled in a matter of minutes? "It's complicated, David. Very complicated. Want to talk? I can come over." "No, I need time to process everything." After hanging up, Jonathan went to the bathroom and looked at his reflection in the mirror. His eyes were red and swollen, his brown hair disheveled. At 34, he had always considered himself a successful man, a respected lawyer, a stable marriage, a planned life. Now, it all seemed like an illusion. He remembered the first time he noticed something different about Sarah. It had been about 4 months ago, when she started coming home late from work more frequently. She said she was working on a new project at the advertising agency, but now he realized the signs he had ignored, the text messages she hid, the phone calls she answered in another room, the way she pulled away when he tried to hug her, and Marcus, his best friend since their days at Columbia University, the man who had been his best man, who had consoled Jonathan when his father died, who had celebrated every professional victory alongside him. Jonathan picked up the phone again, his hands trembling as he looked for Marcus's number. He needed to hear the truth from the traitor's own mouth. "Hello?" Marcus's familiar voice sounded from the other end of the line. "Marcus, it's John. We need to talk." There was a long pause. "John, About what?" "You know very well about what. About you and Sarah. About the baby." Another silence. Jonathan could hear traffic noise in the background. Marcus probably on his way to work at the investment bank. "John, I can explain." "Explain?" Jonathan shouted. Explain how you betrayed our friendship, how you slept with my wife, how you let me believe I was going to be a father. It wasn't like that, John. Things just happened. Happened? Jonathan laughed bitterly. You two decided to destroy my life and it just happened? Meet me tonight at Murphy's pub at 8. I'll explain everything. The line went dead. Jonathan looked at the phone, feeling a mixture of anger and sadness consuming him from within. Murphy's pub was one of those typical Irish places in Manhattan, with dark wood, low lights, and the constant aroma of beer and pretzels. Jonathan arrived 15 minutes before 8, choosing a table in the back, away from the crowd watching the baseball game on TV. He ordered a double whiskey, something he rarely did, but circumstances demanded it. His hands were still trembling slightly when Marcus appeared at the door, looking around nervously before locating him. Marcus Thompson looked like he had aged years in just one day. His black hair was disheveled, his tie loose, and there were dark circles under his eyes. He approached the table hesitantly. "John," he said, sitting down, "I don't even know where to begin. How about starting by explaining how you managed to betray 15 years of friendship?" Jonathan responded, his voice cutting. Marcus waved to the waitress and ordered a beer. "You have to understand, John, it wasn't something planned. It wasn't something I wanted to happen. But it happened, multiple times from what I understand." Marcus sighed deeply. "Sarah was going through a difficult time. You two were. She came to me to talk and I should have said no." "What kind of difficult time? Our marriage was fine." "Was it?" Marcus stared at him. "John, you work 16 hours a day. Sarah felt lonely, neglected. She said you two barely talked anymore." Jonathan felt a tightness in his chest. It was true that he had been too focused on work lately. The firm was growing, they had important cases, and he wanted to give Sarah the financial security she deserved. "That doesn't justify what you two did," he said, taking another sip of whiskey. "You're right, it doesn't justify it, but John, you need to know, I fell in love with her." The words hit Jonathan like a punch to the stomach. "You fell in love with her?" "I didn't want to. I fought against it for weeks. But Sarah she's incredible, John. And she was so vulnerable, so lost. She's my wife." Jonathan slammed his fist on the table, making other customers look in their direction. Marcus lowered his voice. "I know. And I know I ruined everything. I ruined our friendship, I ruined your marriage, I ruined my own life too." "Your life? How is your life ruined? You're going to have a child with the woman you say you love. You think it's easy for me? Knowing I destroyed my best friend's life? Knowing my child will grow up amid all this confusion?" Jonathan looked at Marcus, trying to find some trace of the man who had been his chosen brother for so many years, but all he saw was a stranger. "Is Sarah going to leave you?" Marcus asked hesitantly. "I don't know. I don't even know if I want her to stay. How can I trust her again? How can I look at her every day knowing she betrayed me with my best friend? What about the baby?" Jonathan felt a deep pain in his chest. He had dreamed of being a father, had imagined teaching his child to play baseball, helping with homework, being the kind of father he himself never had. "It's not my baby," he said quietly, "but you could be his father, John. If you and Sarah can work things out." "Work things out?" Jonathan laughed bitterly. "Marcus, do you really think it's that simple? That I can just pretend nothing happened?" Marcus fell silent, nervously fidgeting with his beer. "I want you out of my life," Jonathan said finally. "I want you out of Sarah's life too, at least until the baby is born. Let us try to figure out what we're going to do without your presence complicating everything." "John, I can't just abandon my child. You should have thought of that before sleeping with my wife." Jonathan stood up, leaving money on the table. "Don't contact me anymore, Marcus. When I'm ready to talk about the baby, I'll call you." He left the pub, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts and regrets. A week had passed since the confrontation at Murphy's pub. Jonathan was temporarily living in a hotel near the office, unable to return home and face the memories that each room brought. Sarah had called several times, but he still wasn't ready to talk. It was Rebecca, Sarah's younger sister, who finally convinced him to meet with his wife. She showed up at his office on a rainy Thursday afternoon, her presence surprising Jonathan. "Rebecca, what are you doing here?" Rebecca Martinez was 2 years younger than Sarah, but had always seemed more mature. She worked as a clinical psychologist in Brooklyn and had a direct way of approaching problems. "I came to talk about my sister," she said, sitting in the chair across from his desk. "And about you." "There's nothing to talk about, Rebecca. Sarah made her choice. She made a terrible mistake, John. But she loves you." Jonathan laughed humorlessly. "Interesting way of showing love. You're both destroying your lives out of pride and hurt, And there's an innocent child in the middle of all this, a child that isn't mine. Biologically, no. But John, you planned to have this child with Sarah. You bought little clothes, chose names, painted the nursery. Does all that disappear because the DNA doesn't match? Jonathan turned to the window, watching the rain falling over Manhattan. It's more complicated than that, Rebecca. I know it is. But running away won't solve anything. Sarah is devastated. She barely eats, barely sleeps. This can't be good for the baby. And what do you want me to do? Just forgive and forget? I want you to talk to her. A real, honest conversation. No shouting, no accusations. Just the two of you trying to understand what happened and what you want for the future. Jonathan sighed. Is she willing to talk? She's desperate to talk. John, she told me she'd rather die than live without you. That night, Jonathan returned home for the first time in a week. The key still worked in the lock, but everything seemed different. The apartment was immaculately clean, as if Sarah had channeled all her anxiety into organization. He found her in the kitchen, making tea. She was visibly thinner, except for the belly that continued to grow. Her eyes were red and swollen. "Hi," she said softly. "Hi." They sat at the kitchen table, the same place where they had eaten breakfast together for 4 years of marriage, the same place where they had planned summer vacations, discussed nursery decoration, dreamed about the future. "I don't know where to start," Sarah said, her hands trembling slightly. "Start at the beginning. When did it begin?" Sarah took a deep breath. "Do you remember the day we found out I was pregnant?" Jonathan nodded. How could he forget? They had celebrated, called their families, started planning everything. That night, after you fell asleep, I stayed awake thinking. I was so happy, but also scared, and you seemed so distant lately. I was working a lot, but that doesn't justify— I know. Let me finish, please. Sarah wiped away tears. I started talking to Marcus, first by text, then by phone. He was always a good listener, you know that. Jonathan knew. Marcus had always been the group's mediator, the counselor, the shoulder to cry on. The conversations became more frequent. He made me feel seen, understood. And I know that's no excuse, but I felt so alone, John. You could have talked to me. I tried, but you were always busy, always stressed about work. When I tried to talk about my fears about pregnancy, you'd say everything would be fine and change the subject. Jonathan remembered. It was true. He had thought he was being optimistic, supportive. He didn't realize he was being dismissive. "When did it happen the first time?" he asked. 2 months ago. I was having terrible morning sickness, and you had stayed at the office late again. Marcus came by to see how I was, and I broke down. I cried for an hour, talked about how neglected I felt, about how I was afraid you didn't really want the baby. I wanted the baby, Sarah, I do. I know that now. But at that moment I didn't know. And Marcus comforted me, held me, and things just happened. Just happened. Jonathan repeated the same words Marcus had used. I regretted it immediately, but at the same time I felt alive for the first time in months, and that made me feel even worse. How many times? Sarah hesitated. Are you sure you want to know? I need to know everything, Sarah. If we're going to have any chance of moving forward, I need to know everything. 5 times. Over 2 months. Jonathan felt like he had taken another punch. 5 times. The last time was 3 weeks ago. I told Marcus we needed to stop, that I couldn't live with the guilt anymore. He said he loved me and wanted me to leave you. And you? Do you love him? Sarah looked directly into his eyes. I thought I did, but when I saw your reaction yesterday, when I saw the pain I caused, I realized I was confusing attention with love. I love you, John. I've always loved you. Even with the baby being his? Even with the baby being his? They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of the situation hanging over them like a heavy cloud. I don't know if I can forgive, Jonathan admitted. I don't know if I can forget. I'm not asking you to forget, I'm asking for a chance to regain your trust. And Marcus, he'll want to be in the baby's life. He'll have to accept whatever boundaries we set. The baby may be biologically his, but if you want, you can be the father in every other sense. Jonathan looked at Sarah's belly, imagining the child growing inside, a child he had planned to love, that he had dreamed of meeting. I need time, he said finally. I need time to think, to decide if we can fix this. How much time do you need? I don't know. But Sarah, if we do this, if we try to save our marriage, you need to promise you'll be completely honest with me from now on. About everything. I promise. And we'll need help. Couples therapy. Someone to help us navigate through all this. Sarah nodded quickly. Anything you want. Jonathan stood up, feeling emotionally and physically exhausted. I'll stay at the hotel for a few more nights. I need to process all this. I love you, John. He stopped at the kitchen door. I love you too, Sarah. That's why this hurts so much. 3 weeks later, Jonathan and Sarah were sitting in the waiting room of Dr. Elena Rodriguez's office, a couples therapist recommended by Rebecca. The environment was welcoming, with soft colors and plants that created an atmosphere of tranquility. Sarah was in her 7th month of pregnancy now, and her belly had grown considerably. Jonathan had returned home the previous week, but they were still sleeping in separate rooms, carefully navigating around each other. Mr. and Mrs. Miller? Doctor. Rodriguez appeared at the door, a middle-aged woman with graying hair and a warm smile. You can come in. The office was even more welcoming than the waiting room. 2 comfortable armchairs were positioned at an angle, with a small table between them. Dr. Rodriguez sat in a chair facing them. Before we begin, I want you to know that this is a safe space. Everything we say here is confidential, and my goal is to help you find a way forward, whatever that may be. Jonathan and Sarah nodded. Sarah, why don't you start by telling us what brought you here? Sarah took a deep breath. I cheated on my husband. I had an affair with his best friend, and the baby I'm expecting is that man's, not my husband's. Dr. Rodriguez nodded without showing judgment. And Jonathan, how do you feel about that? Devastated, betrayed, confused. I love my wife, but I don't know if I can trust her again. And there's an innocent child in the middle of all this. Have you both made progress since discovering the affair? Jonathan and Sarah looked at each other. We're trying, Sarah said. John came back home. We're talking more, but it's still very difficult. What's most difficult, Jonathan? The images in my head. Knowing she was with him while I was working, thinking I was building a future for our family. And every time I look at her, I wonder if she's telling me the whole truth. Sarah, how do you respond to that? I completely understand. I broke his trust in a terrible way, but I really want to regain that trust. I'm willing to do anything. Have you established any boundaries about contact with Marcus? I haven't spoken to him in a month, Sarah said. I changed my phone number, blocked him on all social media, but he's going to be the baby's biological father. Eventually, we'll have to deal with that. Dr. Rodriguez made some notes. Jonathan, have you thought about what kind of relationship, if any, you'd like Marcus to have with the child? I don't know. Part of me wants him to just disappear, but another part knows that's not fair to the baby. A child has the right to know their biological father. And if you manage to rebuild your marriage, how would you feel about being the child's social father? Jonathan hesitated. I've been dreaming of being a father for years. When Sarah got pregnant, I started imagining everything. Teaching my child to ride a bike, helping with homework, all those little things that make a family. The fact that the baby isn't biologically mine doesn't erase those dreams. Sarah began crying silently. I ruined everything. I ruined our dreams. You made a terrible mistake, Dr. Rodriguez said gently, but mistakes can be overcome if both parties are willing to work hard for it. They spent the rest of the session discussing communication strategies and establishing small goals. Dr. Rodriguez suggested they have daily 15-minute conversations about how they were feeling, without judgments or accusations. After the session, they walked silently to the car. It was a sunny October afternoon, and the leaves were starting to change color. How do you feel? Sarah asked when they reached the car. Hopeful, I guess. For the first time in weeks, I feel like maybe we can get through this. Me too. That night they cooked together for the first time since the revelation. Nothing elaborate, just simple pasta with salad. But there was something comforting about the domestic routine, the normalcy of sharing a meal. Did you feel the baby move today? Jonathan asked. Sarah smiled. Yes. He's quite active. Want to feel? Jonathan hesitated for a moment, then extended his hand. Sarah placed it on her belly, and almost immediately he felt a small kick. Wow, he said, his eyes widening. That's incredible. He's always more active after I eat. Jonathan kept his hand there, feeling more movement. For a moment he forgot all the pain and betrayal, focusing only on the life growing inside his wife. I want to be his father, he said softly. I want to be there when he's born. I want to be the one he calls Dad. Are you sure? I'm sure. But Sarah, this means we'll have to define very clearly what Marcus's role will be in the baby's life, and you'll have to accept that this will always be complicated. I accept. Anything so we can be a family. Jonathan removed his hand from her belly and held hers. We're going to make it, Sarah. It won't be easy, but we're going to make it. 2 months later, Sarah was in labor at Mount Sinai Hospital. Jonathan held her hand while she went through a particularly intense contraction, her face contorted with pain. "You're doing great, love," he murmured, wiping sweat from her forehead with a damp towel. It had been 2 months of intensive therapy, difficult conversations, and slow rebuilding of trust. Not every day was easy. There were moments of doubt, discussions about Marcus, and nights when Jonathan still woke up with nightmares about the betrayal. But there were also moments of progress, small victories that reminded them why they had fallen in love. "It's time to push," said Dr. Patricia Williams, the obstetrician who had followed Sarah throughout the pregnancy. Jonathan looked at his wife, seeing the determination in her eyes despite the pain. "You can do it, Sarah. We're almost there." 3 pushes later, the sound of a baby's cry filled the room. Jonathan felt tears streaming down his face when he saw the small human being that the nurse was cleaning and examining. "It's a boy," announced Dr. Williams, "a healthy and perfect boy." "Is he okay?" Sarah asked, exhausted but anxious. "He's perfect, 8 pounds and 2 ounces. The nurse brought the baby to Sarah, placing him in her arms. Jonathan leaned in to get a better look at his son, because that's what he was, regardless of genetics. "Hello, little one," Sarah whispered. "I'm your mummy." The baby stopped crying, his small eyes trying to focus on her face. Jonathan extended his finger, and the baby immediately grabbed it with his tiny hand. "He's perfect," Jonathan said, his voice choked with emotion. "Do you want to hold him?" Sarah asked. Jonathan nodded, carefully extending his arms. The baby settled against his chest, so small and vulnerable. In that moment, Jonathan knew with absolute certainty that he would love this child as if he were his own flesh and blood. "Welcome to the world, Daniel," he whispered. They had chosen the name together the previous week. "I'm your daddy." 3 days later, they were home, adapting to the new routine of parents. Jonathan had taken 2 weeks off work, and Sarah was recovering well from childbirth. Daniel was a relatively calm baby, waking only to nurse and for diaper changes. It was in the 2nd week that Marcus appeared. Jonathan was changing Daniel's diaper when the doorbell rang. Sarah was napping, so he went to answer, carrying the baby with him. "Marcus," he said, opening the door. Marcus looked nervous, his hands trembling slightly. "Hi, John. I know you said not to come, but I needed to see my son." Jonathan looked at the man who had been his best friend for so many years. The anger he had felt had diminished to a dull ache, but it was still there. "Do you want to come in?" Jonathan asked finally. Marcus nodded, entering hesitantly. They sat in the living room, Daniel sleeping in Jonathan's arms. "He's beautiful," Marcus said, his voice full of emotion. "He looks like Sarah." "He looks like himself," Jonathan replied. "He's just a baby." Can I hold him?" Jonathan hesitated, then carefully transferred Daniel to Marcus's arms. Seeing his former best friend holding his wife's child was surreal, but Jonathan had prepared for this moment in therapy. "I'm sorry, John," Marcus said, looking at the baby. "I'm sorry for everything." "I know. How are you? You and Sarah?" "We're working on it day by day." Marcus rocked Daniel gently. "I want to be in his life, but I understand that you need to set the boundaries." Jonathan had spent weeks thinking about this. "He can know you as Marcus, a family friend. When he's older, if he wants to know about his biological paternity, we'll tell him the truth. But I'm his father. I'm the one who's going to raise him, who's going to be present every day." "That's fair," Marcus said. "More than fair." "And Marcus, you can't be part of my life anymore. Not the way it was before. Maybe someday we can be friends again, but that's going to take time. A lot of time." Marcus nodded, tears in his eyes. "I understand." He returned Daniel to Jonathan and stood up. Can I visit him sometimes, maybe once a month?" "Yes, but you need to call first. You can't just show up." "Of course." Marcus headed to the door, then turned around. "John, thank you for letting me meet him, and for being the father he deserves." After Marcus left, Jonathan stood holding Daniel, looking at the small, perfect face. Sarah appeared on the stairs, still in her robe. "Was that Marcus?" she asked. "It was. He wanted to meet Daniel." "How do you feel?" Jonathan thought for a moment. "Sad, but also at peace, I guess." "We're going to make it, Sarah. All of us." Sarah approached, putting her arms around him and the baby. "We're going to make it." That night, after Daniel was sleeping in his crib, Jonathan and Sarah sat on the balcony of their apartment, looking at the city lights. The journey had been long and painful, but they had made it to the other side. "Do you regret it?" Sarah asked softly. "Staying with me? Accepting Daniel?" Jonathan looked at his wife, seeing the woman he had chosen to love, with all her flaws and imperfections. "No, I don't regret it. We made mistakes, both of us. But Daniel is innocent in all this, and he deserves to have parents who love him." "I love you, Jonathan Miller. I love you too, Sarah Miller." And there, under the New York stars, they began the next chapter of their lives, not as the perfect couple they had thought they were, but as two imperfect people who had chosen to fight for the love and family they had built together.